The Milo Hanson buck is, in my opinion, one of the most amazing animals to ever walk the face of this planet. Certainly, there's other animals that could be included in that conversation, but especially when it comes to North America and specifically white-tailed deer, this deer really stands towards the top. One would be very hard-pressed to talk about world-class white-tailed deer without this buck being a part of the conversation. Hanson actually died about 3 weeks ago, but both he and this deer that he shot will be remembered in the whitetail community forever. The story of this deer starts actually about a year before Milo killed it. It's 1992, near the end of deer season in northern Saskatchewan, and a bus driver by the name of Jim Angelopoulos, he's a regular at the local coffee shop in the town of Berg, Saskatchewan. But he begins reporting seeing what he described as a huge buck that he's been seeing in the alfalfa fields north of the town of Berg. Jim's not a hunter himself, but being from the area in a community of hunters, he knows a big deer when he sees one. And as time goes on and more people begin to see this deer, it grows in popularity. More and more conversations are taking place about this deer, both in the coffee shop and around the community. And with deer season now over, the big question was, will this deer survive the harsh northern winter of northern Saskatchewan? That question was answered in late summer 1993 when Milo Hanson's neighbor reported to Hanson seeing a very large buck in a section of timber on his property that was adjacent to Milo's. The deer was in velvet at the time, but the way that this guy was describing the deer to Hanson really made him think that this had to be the same deer that Jim had seen on his bus route the year before. That year, rifle season opener was on Monday, November 15th. And there was a buzz in the air. Everybody had seen this deer or had talked to somebody that had seen it. And everybody thought maybe they would have an opportunity at this deer. Opening day for Milo Hanson really was fairly uneventful. He had met with some of his friends and gone hunting at his farm. But they only had one brief encounter with the deer. They had actually seen it at quite a distance. In fact, the deer was on some private land that they didn't even have access to at the time. Another group of hunters that was in the same general vicinity, however, did have a pretty close encounter with the deer. They were conducting a drive in this thick section of woods, and the deer came charging out the other side when one of the hunters had an opportunity to shoot. And as fate would have it, however, they missed, and the buck lived to see another day. Milo and his friends hunt pretty hard over the course of the next week, the first week of deer season, with very little luck. I think they had 2 sightings of the deer in that week's time. What was proving to be difficult was finding the deer's track, and that was how they did a lot of their hunting. They had identified the track of a large deer that they wanted to hunt and see where it was at, what cover it was in, and they would drive that. But finding the track of this deer was proving difficult. We know now that the deer at the time that Milo shoots it was about 4.5 years old. In fact, Milo himself said that the deer had a fairly average sized body. It wasn't a huge deer. They described the track as being similar to that of a large doe. And so that, coupled with the fact that they hadn't had any fresh snow since before the start of deer season, was making it very difficult for them to get on the track of this deer. And so really, they would have to physically see the deer and then go to where the deer was at and get on the track in order to be confident that they were on the track of the deer that they were hunting, if that makes sense. And so it was hard. Without any fresh snow for a week's time, there was tracks everywhere. They would track what they thought was this deer, and they would end up in a field full of tracks, and that would end the hunt, in essence. The following Monday, November 22nd, 1 week after opening day, they actually get a dusting of snow. Hanson, being a farmer, it's what he did for a living, was running a little bit behind on things at the farm, and so was unable to get out hunting on the 22nd. But knowing that this snow would be advantageous for them in tracking this deer, he calls 3 friends, Walter, Renee, and John, on the evening of the 22nd and makes plans to spend the day on the 23rd out hunting. John was going to be just a little bit later than the others, and so the plan was for Walter and Renee to go out to get to an elevated spot in glass and see if they could locate this deer, so that they could make a move on it. And so John ends up showing up at Hanson's house. They go out to the field and meet up with Walter and Renee, and as luck would have it, they had located this buck. They saw it, as well as a couple other does, going into a patch of willows, and they didn't see it come out the other side. And so they were confident that the deer was still in the patch of willows. And so they talk strategy and decide that Renee, which all of them agreed was the better tracker of the group, would follow the deer's track into the willows while the other 3 posted up on the perimeter. And the thought was that either Renee, as he tracked the deer into the willows, would have an opportunity at the deer himself, or when he kicked up the deer and it busted out of the willows, the other 3 would have an opportunity themselves. The plan worked out fairly well. Renee follows the track into the willows, and just about as soon as he gets into the willows, the deer busts out the other side. But where he busted out and the speed at which he busted out, neither of the 3 hunters posted on the outside were able to get a shot at the deer. The group of hunters continued following the deer's track, but have some difficulty when the track of this buck converges with the track of other deer. It gets up on this field where there's a bunch of other tracks, and they're having a difficult time identifying which track belongs to this deer. And they spend about 2 hours just trying to comb through these tracks and walking the perimeter and road edge to see where this deer went. No doubt the group of hunters starts to lose hope, thinking that the hunt might be over. But about 2 hours later, they catch a glimpse of this deer heading into a 30 to 40 acre section of really thick willows on Hanson's property that he refers to as the Willow Run. It's an extremely thick section of timber, which is kind of a combination of willows and aspen trees that provides really thick cover for deer. And given the fact that this deer was being pressured, most certainly that is what this deer had in mind. Go into this section of thick cover, bed down for protection. Once again, the group of guys decide on a plan, which is very similar to what they had done before. John, Walter, And Hanson would post up on the outside while Renee continued to track the deer into the willows and see if they could have an opportunity at this deer. Renee tracked the deer into the thick cover as he had done before, and ends up kicking the deer out the other side. And when he does so, both John and Hanson actually have an opportunity to fire shots at the deer. They were low percentage shots. The deer was running full out, and both shots end up missing. The deer ends up going into a section of cover, another thick pocket of willows, just like it had both the other times, and they make one more push. Renee stayed on the track. Hanson, Walter, and John posted up on the other side. About as soon as Renee made his way into the willows, the deer once again busted out the other side. And where he busted out was about 100 yards from where Hanson was posted up. The deer was about 100 yards from Hanson, running straight away from him when he pulled the trigger on his Winchester 308. The deer went down instantly. You can just imagine the excitement Hanson and his hunting buddies must have felt. I think John was the one that was in the area and said, "You got him." This was the deer that they had been after for a week now, and a deer that they had been talking about for over a year. But about as fast as the deer went down, it got back up again. The angle at which Hanson's bullet impacted the deer, given the fact that it was running straight away, caused the bullet to actually ricochet off the rib cage and up into the main beam of the right antler, which caused the deer to drop instantly. And in fact, to this day, that bullet is still lodged in the right main beam of that deer. Hanson quickly made his way up to a high point on a bluff and was able to get 2 more shots off and finish off the deer. When Hanson and his 3 friends walked up on the deer, they were amazed at how big the deer was, at how long the tines were, at how wide the spread was. But they weren't aware of just how big this deer was, and they wouldn't be for about a week. On November 29th, a good friend of Hanson's, Adam was his name, came out to the farm to have supper with the Hansons. He had been gone on a moose hunt and had heard about this deer that Hanson shot and wanted to not only see the deer, but put a tape to this massive rack. Adam had a decent amount of experience measuring big game animals and wanted to see just how big this deer was. After measuring the deer and adding up all of his measurements, Adam thought he must have made a mistake. The number that he arrived at was just too big. And so he actually asks Hanson to check his math. And Hanson works his way through the measurements and finds a few small errors, but nothing major. And the number that the two arrive at is 214 inches, 7 7/8 inches larger than the James Jordan buck shot in 1914 in Wisconsin, which was at the time the world record and had been for nearly 80 years. You can just imagine how this hits Hanson and his family and friends. This buck that he thought was just an enormous buck is now not only an enormous buck, but quite possibly the new world record. The 60-day drying period comes and goes, and the deer is scored by a panel of judges from the Boone and Crockett Club. And the score sheet is remarkable. The rack was a typical 12-point frame with 2 additional points on the right side equaling 3 1/8 inches. The inside spread was an unbelievable 27 2/8 inches, with both the right and left main beam measuring 28 4/8 inches. Of the 14 scoreable points, 6 of them measured 11 inches or longer. The gross typical score came in at 220 6/8 inches, and the net typical score at 213 5/8 inches, cementing this deer as the greatest typical whitetail ever killed. The Hanson buck is truly unbelievable. One of the things that makes the story of the Hanson buck so interesting to me is not only the size of the deer, which obviously is a part of it, but is the fact that at so many points along the line, the story could have gone so differently. Take, for example, the bullet that is still lodged in the right main beam of this antler. Had that bullet broken off the antler of this deer, which it could have happened, over half of that right antler would have been unscorable. What could have been a world record deer that easily could have been gone. We also know of 2 other hunters that had an opportunity to shoot at this deer. Had either of those hunters connected with this deer, we'd still be talking about this deer, but in a different context. But as fate would have it, Milo was in the right place at the right time and made an accurate shot when it mattered most. It's been 36 years since Milo shot his deer. Records are meant to be broken, and it's all but certain that at some point this record will fall as well. But regardless of if and when that happens, this deer, along with the man behind it, Milo Hanson, are etched into whitetail history forever.